The January thaw was a liar. It whispered of spring, but brought only the roar of the San Pedro River, a churning, muddy beast chewing at the canyon walls. Marisol Bishop, huddled deep in her husband's old canvas coat, wasn't looking for firewood. She was looking for a reason to face another frozen dawn. And then she saw it. Not a log, but a flash of turquoise and buckskin pinned against a snarl of fallen cottonwoods. It was a child, and he was alive. She didn't think about the treaties, the raids, or the warnings from town. She only saw a boy, small and broken, about to be claimed by the ice. The decision she made in that second would cost her everything that she had and rewrite the law of the Arizona Territory. The sky over the Dragoon Mountains was the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly purple-gray that promised more snow, not the melting that had turned her small homestead into an island of mud. Marisol Bishop cursed the mud, cursed the false warmth of the thaw, and most of all cursed the axe handle that was threatening to splinter in her grip. She was alone. The word was a stone in her gut. She'd been alone for 2 years, ever since the fever took her husband, Robert, and then with cruel indifference, her 6-year-old son, Thomas. The cabin they built together, nestled in a high-walled canyon, miles from the nearest settlement of Fortitude, had become a fortress of her grief. The world outside had shrunk to the simple, brutal tasks of survival: chop wood, check snares, patch the roof, and pray the winter broke before her stores did. This particular morning, the river was the real threat. The San Pedro, usually a docile ribbon of silver, was a violent, swollen torrent. The thaw in the higher peaks had sent a wall of melted snow and ice downstream. It roared, a constant, angry sound that rattled the single glass pane in her window. It had already stolen half her woodpile, dragging the logs away like twigs. She'd been working the ridge well above the flood line, hacking at a stubborn piece of dead mesquite, when she heard a sound beneath the river's roar. It wasn't a crack of wood. It was a cry. Marisol froze her breath, pluming in the frigid air. She told herself it was a coyote, or perhaps a mountain cat. Animals cried. People did not. There were no people out here. The settlers kept to the main road, and the Apache. Well, the Apache were Shadow's whispers you blamed for a spooked horse or a missing calf. You didn't hear them. She heard it again. A high, thin wail cut short by a choked gasp. Her eyes scanned the riverbank. The water was a chaotic mess of foam, broken ice, and debris. She walked cautiously toward the edge, her boots sinking deep into the sucking mud. The bank was unstable, a sheer 6-foot drop to the churning water. "Hello." Her voice was rough from disuse. The only answer was the grinding of ice floes. She was imagining it. Grief, she knew, made the mind play tricks. She'd heard Thomas call for her a dozen times in the first year, a ghost in the whisper of the pines. She turned to go back to the cold comfort of her cabin, and that's when she saw it. 100 yards downriver, a massive cottonwood had collapsed its roots, torn from the bank. It formed a partial dam, a dangerous tangle of branches and trapped ice. And snagged in the very center of it, a patch of color that didn't belong to the gray-brown world. Turquoise, buckskin, black hair plastered to a small, pale face. It was a boy. Marisol didn't run. Running was impossible in the thick, wet clay. She moved with a desperate, lung-bursting slog, sliding and stumbling down the bank. "Hold on!" she screamed, the words ripped from her throat by the wind. "I'm coming!" The boy was small, maybe 7 or 8. He was Apache, the single feather tied in his wet hair, and the beadwork on his sodden moccasin confirmed it. He was wedged between 2 thick branches, his body half submerged in the lethal water. He was shivering so violently she could see the vibrations from the bank. He wasn't crying anymore. He was just trying to breathe. Marisol's mind raced. She couldn't climb out to him. The branches were slick with ice and would never hold her. The water was a death sentence. She looked around frantic. Her axe, her lariat coiled on her saddleback at the cabin. Too far. It would take 10 minutes. He had 2. "Don't you move!" she yelled, though the boy's eyes were closed, his face a mask of waxy, blue-tinged exhaustion. She scanned the debris line. Her gaze landed on a long, sturdy-looking pole, a piece of lumber perhaps washed away from the new bridge construction near Benson. It was half buried in the mud 20 yards away. She scrambled to it, her fingers raw and bleeding as she dug it free. It was heavy waterlogged, but solid. She dragged it back to the bank, her heart hammering against her ribs, with a pain that was part exertion, part terror. "I'm here," she grunted, planting her feet as wide as she could in the slick mud. She extended the pole inch by inch, fighting the river's current which tried to tear it from her grasp. The end of the pole was still 3 feet short of the boy. "Damn it!" she roared. She had to get closer. She looked at the drop. It was 6 feet, but the bank had been undercut by the water. If it gave way, she'd be in the river with him. She saw the image of her own son, Thomas, his small body still and white in his sickbed. Not again. I will not watch another one die. She edged closer, the mud sucking at her boots. The bank groaned. She jabbed the pole forward, striking the boy hard in the chest. His eyes flew open. They were black, bottomless, and filled with a terror that was older than his years. He didn't make a sound. "Grab it!" Marisol screamed over the water. "Grab the pole, son! Grab it!" He just stared, his small hands frozen to the branch that held him. He was dying. "Please!" she whispered, the fight going out of her. "Please, God!" And then the boy did something unexpected. He didn't grab the pole. He let go of the branch. For a heart-stopping second, he was free, and the current snatched him. He was being swept under the log jam. Marisol reacted without thought. She dropped the pole, threw herself flat onto the mud, and lunged her arm, plunging into the freezing water up to the shoulder. Her fingers closed on a fistful of wet buckskin. The shock of the cold was so intense it stole her breath. It was a physical blow, a pain of 1,000 needles driving into her skin. But she held on. The boy's weight combined with the force of the water was immense. The mud beneath her chest began to give way. She was sliding. "No!" she screamed, clawing at the bank with her free hand, her fingernails packing with dirt and gravel. She couldn't pull him out. He was a dead weight and she was slipping in. She had one chance. She braced her feet against a half-buried rock and pulled. It wasn't a lift. It was a drag. She pulled with the memory of her husband, with the grief for her son, with every ounce of lonely, desperate strength she had left. The river fought her, but she fought back. She dragged the boy inch by agonizing inch out of the main current and onto the slick, muddy bank. He landed in a heap, a small, waterlogged bundle. He was unconscious. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue. She didn't pause. She couldn't. Hypothermia would kill him in minutes. She grabbed him, hoisting him into a fireman's carry. He weighed almost nothing. She fell to one knee and rose again, her body screaming in protest. The 1-mile trek back to her cabin, a walk she did 12 times a day, felt like crossing a continent. The wind picked up driving icy sleet into her face. The boy in her arms did not stir. He felt as cold as the ice on the river. By the time she reached the cabin, she was running on pure adrenaline. She kicked the door open and stumbled inside, dropping the boy onto the bearskin rug in front of the cold hearth. For a moment, she just knelt, gasping, her lungs on fire. The cabin was silent, save for her ragged breathing and the howl of the wind outside. The boy looked like a drowned doll. "No," Marisol whispered. She scrambled to the fireplace, her hands shaking so badly she could barely strike the match. She lit the tinder, adding kindling with a desperate urgency. As the small flames licked at the larger logs, she turned back to the boy. His clothes were a death sentence. She had to get them off. Her fingers numb and clumsy fumbled with the wet leather ties. She didn't have time for delicacy. She grabbed her skinning knife from the table and sliced through the laces of his tunic and leggings, peeling the freezing wet layers from his small frame. His skin was mottled icy to the touch. His breathing was shallow, a faint, fluttering puff of air. She stripped off her own sodden coat and grabbed the heavy wool blankets from her bed. She wrapped him, swaddling him tightly, and then did the only other thing she could think of. She lay down on the rug beside him, pulling him against her own body, wrapping the blankets around them both. She rubbed his back, his chest, his tiny frozen limbs, trying to force her own life, her own warmth into him. "You live, you hear me," she muttered into his wet hair. "You live." Outside, the sleet turned to snow. The river roared. And inside the small, isolated cabin, Marisol Bishop held the son of her sworn enemies in her arms and waited for a breath. For an hour, there was no sound but the fire's crackle and the rising shriek of the wind. The thaw was over. A full-blown blizzard was descending from the peaks, a wall of white that erased the world outside. Inside, Marisol did not move. She held the boy, her own shivering, finally subsiding as the fire took hold, pouring warmth into the small room. His breathing, at first a shallow flutter, deepened. A cough rattled in his chest. Then a groan. He woke all at once. 1 second, he was a limp, cold weight. The next, he was a blur of frantic motion. He exploded out of her arms with a choked cry, scrambling backward on the rug until his bare back hit the hot stones of the hearth. He yelped, leaping away from the fire and landing in a crouch in the far corner of the cabin, between the flour sacks and the woodpile. His eyes were wide black and utterly feral. He looked like a trapped coyote, his small chest heaving. He bared his teeth. Marisol sat up slowly, holding her hands out, palms open. "It's all right," she said, her voice a low calm she did not feel. "You're safe. The river. I pulled you from the river." He didn't understand her words, only the threat of her presence. He was naked, save for the single wet feather still tangled in his hair. He was vulnerable, and he knew it. His eyes darted from her to the door, to the rifle mounted over the fireplace, and back to her. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her heart pounding. This was not a child, not in the way her Thomas had been. This was a piece of the wild, and she had dragged it into her home. The stories from Fortitude flooded her mind. Settlers found with arrows in their backs, homesteads burned, children stolen. She was alone, miles from help with one of them. The boy's gaze fixed on the skinning knife she had used, still lying on the table. Marisol saw his focus shift. Before he could move, she stood deliberately placing her body between him and the table. "No!" she said, her voice firm. He hissed a low animal sound from deep in his chest. They were in a standoff. She a 30-year-old widow, armed with nothing but a set of woolens, and he an 8-year-old boy who looked ready to tear her throat out. "You're cold," she said, trying again. "And you're hurt." She took a step toward him. He flinched, pressing himself so hard against the logs of the wall that splinters must have been digging into his bare skin. "Let me look at you," she said. She noticed it then. His left arm was held at a strange angle, his wrist swollen and already turning a dark purple. And there was a long, deep gash on his leg just above the knee, sluggishly weeping blood. He hadn't just been in the river. He'd been beaten by it. "That arm is broken," she said softly. "And that leg needs sewing." She took another step. He lunged, not for the knife, but for the door. He scrambled, got his hand on the iron latch and pulled. It wouldn't budge. The wind screamed outside, rattling the heavy plank. He pulled again, desperate, using his good hand. "It's no use," she said. "There's a blizzard out there. You'll die in 10 minutes. You almost died in the river. You will not die in the snow." He turned to face her, breathing hard, his small body tense. He was cornered, and she knew what cornered things did. "I'm going to get my medicine box," she said, pointing to the shelf above her dry sink. "I will not hurt you. I promise." She moved slowly, deliberately, never turning her back on him. He watched her every move. She retrieved the small wooden box. Inside were bandages, a needle catgut thread, and a small bottle of laudanum. She grabbed a clean rag from a drawer and poured water from her kettle, which was just beginning to steam. She knelt on the floor, a good 10 feet from him. "Come to the fire. You're shaking." He didn't move. "Stubborn," she muttered. It reminded her painfully of Thomas. "Fine, I'll come to you." She slid the box and the bowl of hot water across the floor toward the corner. She expected him to kick it away. He didn't. He just watched. "I have to clean that cut," she said. "It's bad." She dipped the rag in the water, her hand shaking slightly. She crept forward on her knees. When she was within arm's reach, he drew his good leg back, ready to kick. "Jonah," she said. The boy froze. His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Is that your name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Jonah, like the man in the whale." She didn't know why she said it. It was a name from Roberta's Bible, a name she had almost given Thomas. It just came out. The boy, of course, gave no sign of recognition. He just stared, his terror momentarily eclipsed by confusion. She used that second. She grabbed his injured leg. He yelped and kicked, but his strength was spent. She held on tight, her grip like iron, and began to clean the wound. He fought her. He writhed and clawed at her with his good hand, but she was stronger. She was a woman used to butchering deer and wrestling fence posts. She held him firm. "Be still," she commanded. "This will hurt, but it will help. Be still." He must have understood the tone, if not the words. He stopped fighting, his body going rigid, a low, pained keen coming from his throat. She worked quickly. The cut was deep, right to the bone, full of sand and river grit. She cleaned it as gently as she could, her touch surprisingly steady. He winced. His eyes squeezed shut, but he did not cry out again. She threaded the needle. "Now this part is bad. Bite this." She offered him a piece of leather strapping. He turned his head away. "Suit yourself." She put the first stitch in. The boy screamed. It was a raw, piercing sound that cut through the howl of the storm. It was the sound of agony. But he did not move. He did not fight. He just lay there, his small body vibrating, his good hand, clutching a piece of firewood, so hard his knuckles were white. She sewed. Stitch after stitch, her movements economical and precise. She was stitching his skin, but it felt like she was stitching something inside herself too. That cold, numb place where her own grief lived. When she was done, she bandaged the wound tightly. Then she looked at his arm. It was a simple break, she thought. His wrist. "This is next," she said almost to herself. She took 2 pieces of shingle from the woodpile and tore more strips of bandage. She looked him in the eye. "This will be worse than the sewing. I need you to be brave." He looked back at her, his black eyes unblinking. There was still fear, but something else had replaced the feral terror. It was a hard, cold understanding. He gave a single sharp nod. She took his small, swollen forearm in her 2 hands. She closed her eyes. 1, 2. On 3, she pulled and twisted. The sound of the bone setting was a dull, sickening pop. It was louder than the boy's gasp. He went utterly limp, his head falling back against the log wall, his face pale as the snow outside. He had fainted. "Thank God," Marisol breathed. She worked quickly now, setting the splint and binding his arm tightly against his chest. She lifted him his body light as a bundle of sticks and carried him away from the cold corner. She laid him on the bearskin rug in front of the fire, as she had intended hours before. She covered him with 2 of her thickest wool blankets. She sat back on her heels, her whole body aching. The firelight played across his face. His features were delicate, his skin a smooth, pale copper. With his eyes closed, the ferocity was gone. He just looked like a boy. The name came back to her. "Jonah," she whispered. "You're my Jonah." She didn't know what it meant, but she knew 2 things for certain. He was alive, and they were trapped. The blizzard had descended a solid wall of white. There was no river, no mountains, no world. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the small, broken enemy sleeping at her feet. The blizzard lasted for 4 days. It was a living thing, a howling white beast that tried to claw its way through the chinks in the logs. The snow piled up past the windowsills, sealing them in. The world shrank to the 20 by 20 square of the cabin. For the first day, the boy whom she now thought of only as Jonah didn't wake. He slept a deep, exhaustive, healing sleep, broken only by fever dreams. He would cry out short, sharp words in his own tongue, his good hand grasping for a weapon that wasn't there. Marisol sat in her rocking chair, her rifle across her lap, and watched him. She fed him broth, spooning it into his mouth when he stirred. He took it unconscious, his body's desperate need for fuel overriding his mind's terror. She kept the fire roaring, burning through her woodpile at a dangerous rate. She tended his wound, changing the bandage and checking for festering. The skin was red, but it was clean. On the second morning, she awoke to find him watching her. He was sitting up, the blankets pooled around his waist. He was still in the corner, having dragged himself back there in the night, his splintered arm held protectively. He looked weaker, but his eyes were clear. The feral look was gone. In its place was a sharp, piercing intelligence. He was assessing her. "Good morning," Marisol said, her voice quiet. He said nothing. "You're hungry," she stated. It wasn't a question. She stood and moved to the hearth, taking down the cast-iron pot. She had made a thin stew of salted pork and beans. She ladled a bowl and set it on the floor, sliding it halfway across the room. "Eat." He stared at the bowl. He looked from it to her and back. He was, she realized, a very proud child. He would not show weakness, but his stomach betrayed him with a low growl. "It's not poisoned," she said, exasperated. She took her own bowl and ate, showing him. "See good." He watched her for another long minute, then, using his good hand, he dragged the bowl toward him and began to eat. He ate with his fingers, his movements quick and efficient, his eyes never leaving her. He finished the bowl, licked his fingers clean, and pushed the bowl back toward the center of the room. And so the pattern was set. The cabin became a silent stage for 2 actors. Marisol would perform her chores, mending her clothes, cleaning her rifle, measuring her dwindling flour. Jonah would sit in his corner, a small, dark-eyed sentinel, and watch. She began to talk to him, not expecting an answer, but simply to fill the overwhelming silence. The sound of the wind was maddening, and she needed another human voice, even if it was just her own. "My husband Robert, he built this fireplace," she said, poking the logs. "He was a blacksmith, hands thick as hams. He said these stones would stand for 100 years. He was wrong about the 100 years. For him, anyway. Jonah watched the fire, his expression unreadable. "We had a son," she said, her voice dropping. "His name was Thomas. He would have been about your age, maybe a little younger." She stopped, a familiar thickness in her throat. "He had hair the color of wheat, not dark like yours. He was always laughing, until he got sick." She looked at Jonah. He was looking at her, his head tilted. He wasn't understanding the words, but he understood the sound. He understood the grief. On the 3rd day she woke, and he was not in his corner. Her heart seized. She grabbed the rifle, her eyes scanning the dim room. He was by the window, standing on her 3-legged stool, peering through a small patch of glass he had scraped free of frost. He was looking outside at the white, endless, churning chaos. "There's nothing out there," she said. He turned. He was wearing one of Thomas's old nightshirts. She had left it out for him, and he had put it on. It was too large, hanging on his small frame like a white shroud. The sight of it, of this Apache boy in her dead son's clothes, was a punch to the gut. He pointed to the window, then to himself. "I go." "You'll do no such thing," she snapped, her emotions raw. "You'd be dead in an hour. You're still weak." He scowled, a perfect, childish expression of frustration. He hopped off the stool and limped. His leg was mending, but still pained him back to his corner. That afternoon, the silence was broken by a different sound, a low, rhythmic scraping. She looked over. He had found a piece of charcoal from the hearth and was drawing on the wooden floor. She walked over, curious. He didn't stop her. He was drawing horses. They were lean, dynamic figures full of life and motion. He drew 10 of them running across the planks. Then he drew a tall, imposing figure on the lead horse. He put an elaborate feathered headdress on the man. He tapped the figure's chest. "Saul," he said. The voice, after 3 days of silence, shocked her. It was high but clear. "Saul," she repeated. He nodded, tapping the man again. "Saul." Then he tapped his own chest. "Jonah." Marisol stared. He was Jonah. It was his name. What spirit had made her speak it? Had she heard it in the river? A name, half biblical, half Apache. A strange crossing of worlds. "Your father," she said, pointing to the drawing of the man. Jonah nodded. "Saul." He looked at her, and for the first time the fear and suspicion were gone. He had given her a name. He had shared his world. The next morning, the 4th day, the wind had stopped. The silence that fell was as heavy and profound as the blizzard itself. Marisol opened the door. It took her 10 minutes, shoving against the massive drift. When she finally cracked it open, the world was blinding. The snow was piled 10 feet high, a smooth, sculpted, pristine white that covered everything. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. Jonah came to stand beside her. He looked out, his face, impassive. "It's over," she said. She knew what this meant. The siege was broken. The truce born of the storm was over. She couldn't keep him. He had a father, a chief, Saul, and Saul would be looking for him. And she, Marisol Bishop, would be the one found with his son. "I have to go to town," she said, more to herself than to him. "I'm out of flour, and I need to see what's happening." She looked at the boy. He was her prisoner, her patient, her companion, and now he was her greatest danger. The journey to Fortitude was a frozen nightmare. It was 5 miles, and it took her 4 hours. She walked, leading her horse, because the drifts were too deep and treacherous to ride. The world was remade in white, the familiar landmarks of her canyon erased. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. She had left Jonah in the cabin. She'd had no choice. She couldn't take him. The sight of an Apache boy with her would get them both killed. So she had locked him in. "You must stay," she had told him, her voice harder than she intended. She pointed to the fire, then to the stew. "Food. Fire. I will be back before dark." He had watched her, his face reverting to the blank, stony mask he'd worn the first day. He understood the lock. He understood he was a prisoner again. He had simply nodded his pride, brittle, and returned to his corner. The betrayal in his eyes was a physical weight she carried with her all the way to town. Fortitude was in a state of barely controlled panic. The blizzard had hit the whole territory, and the town was digging itself out. Men were on the roofs shoveling snow. The single main street was a canyon of packed ice. Her first stop was Pike's Mercantile. The store was crowded, men shouting for supplies, their faces grim. "Marisol!" Mr. Pike said, his eyes wide with surprise. We thought you were a goner child. No one's been up your way. We reckoned the cabin was buried." "It nearly was," she said, handing him her list. "I need flour, salt, and— Mr. Pike, do you have any moccasins?" "Small ones." Pike paused, his hand on the flour sack. "Moccasins for who?" My own are worn through," she lied badly. "My feet have swollen from the cold." Pike looked at her with suspicion, but said nothing, grabbing a pair of child-sized liners from a shelf. The room quieted. She felt the eyes of the other men on her. "Terrible business, this storm," Pike said, lowering his voice as he bagged her goods. "Just terrible. Frank Henshaw is half out of his mind." "Mr. Henshaw? Why, his boy Pete, a rancher named Cole, chimed in, spitting tobacco juice onto the pot-bellied stove. Pete Henshaw went out checking trap lines right before the storm hit. Never came back. Frank's convinced the Apache got him." A cold dread settled in Marisol's stomach. "The Apache." "Damn right," said a new voice. Frank Henshaw himself pushed through the crowd. He was a big man, his face blotched red with cold and fury. His eyes were wild. "They used this storm as cover. They've been raiding the high country. Now they've got my son." "Frank, you don't know that," Pike said weakly. "He's likely just holed up somewhere waiting out the snow." "He's not," Henshaw roared, slamming his fist on the counter. The jerky jars rattled. "I found his horse this morning, lamed, and I found tracks, 12 of them, shod ponies. Apache." He turned his mad eyes, settling on Marisol. "You, Bishop, you live out in that canyon. You seen 'em?" Marisol's blood ran cold. She could feel the moccasin liners in her bag, heavy as stones. I've seen nothing, Mr. Henshaw. The snow's I've been trapped. I've seen no one." Henshaw stepped closer, invading her space. He smelled of whiskey and grief. "You're a liar. You're buying moccasins. Child-sized." The entire store went silent. "I told Mr. Pike." Marisol said, her voice shaking but steady. "My feet are swollen." Henshaw laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You're buying Indian footwear and telling me you ain't seen 'em. They've been to your cabin, haven't they? Threatened you, gave you trinkets for your silence." "Frank, leave her be," Mr. Pike said, but he looked nervous. "She knows something." Henshaw insisted, his gaze burning into her. "My boy is out there, and if I find out anyone in this town is helping those red-skinned devils, I'll burn 'em out myself. I'm riding out sheriff or no sheriff. We'll find Pete, and we'll get justice." He stormed out of the store, followed by Cole and 2 other ranchers. Marisol paid for her goods, her hands trembling so hard she dropped her coins. "You be careful, Marisol," Mr. Pike whispered, not meeting her eye. "Frank's not a bad man, but he's broken. A broken man is more dangerous than a wolf." She fled. The ride back was fueled by a new frantic terror. She wasn't just afraid for Jonah anymore. She was afraid of him, of what he represented, of the war he had inadvertently brought to her door. Henshaw was on a warpath. He was tracking Apache. What if he tracked them? Or Jonah? To her, she had to get him out. She had to let him go. She'd give him food, her husband's old coat, and point him toward the dragoons. It was his only chance. It was her only chance. She spurred her horse the last mile, the animal stumbling in the deep snow. She rounded the last bend, her eyes fixed on the cabin. The plume of smoke from the chimney was gone. "No," she whispered. The fire had gone out. He was freezing. She slid from the saddle and ran, plunging through the drifts. "Jonah." She reached the door. It was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. The heavy bar she had set across it was on the floor, the wood of the door jamb splintered. The lock hadn't been broken from the outside. It had been broken from the inside. She stepped into the cabin. It was empty, and it was freezing cold. "Jonah," she called out, her voice echoing in the small, silent space. He was gone. The stew pot was scrubbed clean. Her sewing needle was missing. A strip of her best bandage was gone. He had taken supplies. On the floor by his corner, the charcoal drawings of the horses were still there. But he had added one more, a small, crude drawing of her cabin with a circle drawn around it. A circle of protection. She ran outside her eyes, scanning the snow. There they were. A single set of small, limping tracks, heading not east toward the town, but straight up the sheer canyon wall toward the high peaks of the dragoons. He had gone home. A profound, staggering sense of loss hit her. It was absurd. He was her enemy, her burden, her danger. And now he was gone, and she felt as empty as she had when Thomas died. She had failed him, locking him in. She had treated him like an animal, and he had treated her like a human. She sank to her knees in the snow, the bag of flour dropping beside her. She had been so afraid of Frank Henshaw, she hadn't realized the real threat. The threat was the silence, the loneliness. Jonah had broken it, and now it was back. She sat there until the sun began to dip behind the canyon wall, casting the world in a cold blue light. She felt numb, defeated. She finally stood, her body stiff, and turned to go back inside to the cold hearth and the empty room. And she saw it. Sitting on the stump she used for chopping wood, placed perfectly in the center, was a small object that hadn't been there when she left. It was an amulet, a small disk of hide, beaded with brilliant blue and white. It was tied with a sinew string. It was Apache. He hadn't just left. He had come back. He had watched her return. He had been on the ridge watching her as she fell to her knees. He had left her a gift, a thank you, a mark. She picked it up. It was still warm from his hand. The amulet was a secret, a heavy weight in her pocket. Marisol rebuilt her fire, the cabin slowly filling with a warmth that couldn't touch the chill inside her. She was truly alone now, and the silence she had once craved was unbearable. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow in the corner looked like a small watching boy. She spent the next day on high alert, her rifle never more than a foot from her hand. She was trapped between two approaching storms. Frank Henshaw and his grieving, drunken posse were scouring the foothills, and somewhere in the mountains, a band of Apache warriors was missing its chief's son. She didn't know who would find her first. She kept replaying the scene at Pike's, Henshaw's rage, the suspicion in the other men's eyes, the child-sized moccasins. She had been marked by the town just as surely as Jonah had marked her with the amulet. She was a pariah, a sympathizer, a woman alone, and therefore a target for fear and blame. She kept scanning the ridge opposite her cabin, the high, snowy crest, She could see for miles. Nothing moved. The landscape was static, locked in ice. Yet she felt with a primal certainty that she was being watched. Was it Jonah? Had he not made it home? Was he still out there freezing, watching the smoke from her chimney? Or was it someone else? That night she couldn't sleep. She sat in the rocker, the rifle across her lap, watching the fire die to embers. She thought of Jonah's small, brave face as she set his bone. She thought of his father, Saul, drawn in charcoal, a powerful man on a powerful horse. He would not be grieving. He would be hunting. The sound came just before dawn. It wasn't the sound of a posse, loud and clumsy. It was the soft thud of horses walking on packed snow, the faint jingle of a bridle. Her heart hammered. She doused the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the red glow of the embers. She crept to the window, scraping a tiny patch of frost. They were there, materializing from the pre-dawn shadows of the blue pines, not 1 but 10 riders. They were not settlers. They were Apache. They sat on their horses in a perfect, silent line at the edge of her clearing, steam pluming from the horses' nostrils. They were not in war paint, but they were armed to the teeth, rifles in scabbards, bows slung over their backs. They just sat watching her cabin, their forms dark silhouettes against the snow. This was it. They had come for her. They must have found Jonah's tracks, followed them to her door. They would think she had captured him, hurt him, killed him. Her hands were slick with sweat on the stock of her rifle. She could take 1, maybe 2, but there were 10. She was going to die. Here in the cabin Robert built, she was going to die for saving a boy she didn't even know. One rider moved. He dismounted his movements, fluid and precise. He was taller than the others, with a presence that commanded the frozen air. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, but she could see the intricate beadwork on his quiver. He handed his reins to the man beside him and began to walk unarmed toward her door. Marisol pressed the rifle barrel into the small gap in the window frame. "That's far enough," she yelled, her voice high and tight. The man stopped. He was 20 yards away. He held his hands up open to show they were empty. "I seek the woman," he said. His voice was deep and it carried. He spoke English, broken but clear. "I'm here," she said, her eye still sighting down the barrel. "What do you want, my son?" It was Saul. It had to be. The drawing hadn't done him justice. He was terrifying. "Your son is not here," she said. "He's gone." "I know," the chief replied. He took a step closer. "My son is in my camp. He is safe. He has a broken arm. He has stitches in his leg." Marisol's breath hitched. He made it. He made it," Saul confirmed. He lowered his hands slowly. "He told me of the river. He told me of the white woman who pulled him from the ice. He told me of the fire and the medicine." Marisol lowered the rifle, her knees weak with a relief, so profound it almost buckled her. She stepped back from the window, her mind reeling. He wasn't here for revenge. She heard his footsteps on her porch. A knock. Firm, respectful. She opened the door. He stood before her, a giant of a man, his face a map of hard lines, his black eyes sharp enough to cut. He was not smiling. This was not a social call. "You are the woman," he stated. "I am," she said. "You saved my son, Jonah." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the beaded amulet. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then back at her. "He marked you. A friend." I locked him in," she confessed, the shame rising. "I was afraid. I went to town." "We know," Saul said. A chill entirely different from the cold ran down her spine. Saul turned his head, gesturing to the ridge. The same ridge she had been watching. She squinted. At first she saw nothing but snow and rock, and then a flicker of movement. A single rider positioned on the highest peak, a black dot against the blinding white. "He has watched you for a month," Saul said. "We watched the soldiers. We watched the ranchers. We watched this canyon. He saw me. He saw me pull Jonah from the river. He saw everything." Saul said, "He saw you carry him. He saw you take him inside. He saw the smoke from your chimney for 4 days. He saw you ride to the town. He saw the white men, the posse, follow you back." Marisol's blood turned to ice. Henshaw. "They were on the ridge last night," Saul said, his voice flat. "The men who hunt my people, the man who lost his son. They watched your cabin. They debated the fire." What did you do?" she whispered. Saul looked at his 10 riders, sitting like stone statues. "We were also on the ridge. We were closer. He had been protecting her. The 10 riders hadn't been hunting for Jonah. They had been a shadow army, a silent guard, watching Henshaw's posse, protecting the woman who had their chief's son. The realization was so immense, she had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. "My son," Saul said, turning back to her. "He has his mother's spirit, but he does not have your strength. He would be dead." "My son, my only son." He stepped back from the door and raised his hand. The 10 riders dismounted. They moved not to their weapons, but to the packs on their horses. Each man pulled out a heavy folded wool blanket. They were beautiful, woven with patterns of red and black and blue. "We do not take," Saul said. "We trade, a life for a life. But you have no debt. This is a gift for the woman who fights the river." One by one the riders approached and laid the blankets on her porch. 10 thick, warm, precious blankets. A fortune in the territory. More warmth than she had ever known. Matimda could only stare. She was speechless. When the last blanket was laid, the men returned to their horses. Saul gave her a long, final look. "The man Henshaw, he hunts you. He hunts us. He will not find us, but he will find you. You should not be here alone." "This is my home," she said, finding her voice. Saul nodded a flicker of something. "Respect, you are brave, but you are one. He is many." "What about his son, Pete?" she asked. Saul's face hardened. "We are not murderers of children. We hunt. We fight soldiers. We do not steal boys from trap lines." He turned and walked back to his horse. "Wait," she called. He paused. "I found this, by the river, before the storm," she said, lying. "It was in the mud." She held out the small, child-sized moccasin liner she had bought at Pike's. Saul looked at it. He walked back and took it from her. He studied it. It was not Apache work. It was settler-made. He said nothing. He just mounted his horse in one fluid motion. He raised his chin to his men, and as one the 11 riders turned and vanished back into the pines. They made no sound. They were gone. Marisol stood on her porch, surrounded by the bright, beautiful blankets, the steam from her breath the only thing moving in the clearing. An hour later, as the sun climbed higher, she heard them. This time, it was not the silent approach of the Apache. It was the clumsy, loud and angry sound of Henshaw's posse. There were 6 of them, including Frank Henshaw and Sheriff Brody, a man who always looked 2 steps behind everyone else. They rode into her clearing, their horses tired, their faces caked with ice. "Mrs. Bishop," Sheriff Brody called out, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes immediately went to the pile of rich, vibrant blankets on her porch. "Sheriff!" Marisol stood in the doorway, her rifle not in her hand, but leaning just inside, visible. Frank Henshaw didn't wait for pleasantries. He dismounted his shotgun in his grip and stormed onto her porch. "What the hell is this?" he roared, kicking one of the blankets. "Where did you get these? This is posh work." "They were a gift, Mr. Henshaw," Marisol said, her voice cold. "A gift from who from them?" His eyes were manic. "They were here. You've been harboring 'em. I knew it. You're a traitor woman." "Frank, calm yourself," Brody said, stepping up his hand on his pistol. "Mrs. Bishop, you need to explain this, and you need to do it now." "There's nothing to explain," Marisol said. "They came. They left. And they just gave you these," Henshaw spat, "after they stole my son." "They didn't steal your son, Frank," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of fear. She had faced Saul. Henshaw was just a bully with a broken heart. "You lie." He raised his shotgun. "Frank, no," Brody yelled, grabbing for the barrel. "They didn't steal him," a new voice said. Everyone froze. A single Apache rider emerged from the pines. It was not Saul. It was the scout, the one who had been on the ridge. He was leading a horse, Henshaw's horse. "Where did you get that?" Henshaw whispered, his face ashen. The scout rode forward, his face impassive. He led the horse into the clearing. Draped over the saddle, frozen solid, was the body of Pete Henshaw. A terrible animal wail came from Frank Henshaw's throat. He dropped his shotgun and stumbled, falling to his knees in the snow. He was found, the scout said, his English as good as Saul's. 2 canyons over. He fell, broke his leg. The storm. It took him. He was not touched by us. We do not harm children. Sheriff Brody walked slowly to the horse. He looked at the boy, then pulled the blanket back over his face. He looked at the scout. "Why? Why bring him back?" "The Chief Saul wishes it," the scout said. "We are not the savages you hunt. The debt, it is paid." He looked past the men, his eyes meeting Marisol's. He nodded once, a gesture of profound, silent understanding. Then he turned his horse, and like the others melted into the forest. The clearing was silent, broken only by the sound of Frank Henshaw sobbing. The other men in the posse shuffled their bravado, gone, their faces pale. They were ranchers, not murderers, and they were looking at a dead boy and a pile of blankets they couldn't explain. Sheriff Brody looked at Marisol. He looked at the blankets, then at Henshaw, then back at her. He didn't understand what had happened. He just knew it was over. "Marisol," he said, his voice heavy. I reckon we'll take Pete back to his pa. We won't be bothering you again." He and the other men lifted the small frozen body from the saddle and helped the broken-down Frank Henshaw onto his horse. They rode away slowly, a funeral procession, leaving a field of battle. Marisol Bishop was left alone. She stood on her porch for a long time, the sun high and bright, reflecting off the snow. She picked up the top blanket. It was heavy, woven with the colors of the desert, and it smelled of wood smoke and pine. She went inside and spread it on her bed. She took the others and stacked them neatly at the foot. Her cabin, once so cold and empty, was filled with color. She was still alone, but the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of strength. The river still roared in the distance, but it was no longer an enemy. It was just the river. She had pulled a freezing boy from the water, and in return, a chief had pulled her from a war. The scales were balanced. She took the beaded amulet Jonah had left her and hung it on the wall right above the drawing of her son Thomas. They were, she realized, both her boys. The blankets remained. They were a testament warmer than wool to an understanding forged in the ice. Marisol Bishop was still alone in her canyon, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the knowledge that courage and compassion were a language spoken on both sides of the frontier. She had faced the wild both in the land and in the hearts of men, and found an unexpected grace. A single act of humanity had built a bridge that no treaty could ever replicate, and no posse could ever burn. Her story, like the river, carved its own path through the unforgiving West, a testament that even in the deepest winter, a single hand reaching out can thaw a frozen world. If this story of courage and unlikely connection moved you, please honor Marisol's strength by hitting that like button. Share this story with others who appreciate the true complex history of the West, and subscribe for more tales of survival and the human spirit. Thank you for listening.